All right, I think we're live now. All right, welcome to Deeper Than Dogma. Tonight we are going to be talking about a book that was recommended to me a few weeks back by Ozzy here on the topic of the disappearance of childhood. We brought this up briefly in a hangout, and I thought it was an interesting. And there was the way that we were talking about it beforehand. There was a lot of parts of it that I disagreed with. Then, as I read the book, I kind of understood a little bit more where the author was coming from. And although I do have some disagreements here, I was hoping that maybe we can discuss some of the aspects of this book in this hangout. So the title of the book was The Disappearance of Childhood by Neil Postman. And the basic thesis of the book, the basic idea, is that in our current time here, modern media, especially things like television, are going to be leading to a disappearance of childhood in North America. That at the rate that we're going now, at the way that we see some of this media affecting our society, that the entire idea of childhood will not survive to the end of the century. That Neil Postman kind of puts out there this idea that this is going to lead to a, as he puts it, a social disaster of the highest order. Now, one of the things that the book talks about is the foundation of childhood, where the idea of childhood, where it kind of came from, and that he puts out that childhood is this social artifact that within our genes there contain no instructions on what or who a child is, and laws of survival do not require a distinction be made between an adult and child. So we deposit that this idea of child. It's this special class of people between the ages of 7 and 17 generally that require a special form of nurturing and protection. That there is this fundamental belief that there is a difference between childhood and adulthood. Now, this hasn't always been the case. The most evidence that we have point to this idea that childhood is a construct less than 400 years old. Our actual modern understanding of childhood is probably less than 150 years old. It's this is an idea that's being refined and tuned essentially for the last several hundred years. And childhood itself, like I said, as we know now, is still relatively new. As late as the 1890s, for example, high schools in the U.S. enrolled only about 7% of people between the ages of 14 and 17. Most others, including actually children much younger than that, still worked adult labor jobs. Now, even though that these were kind of like these are kind of like the social facts of the time that we have here, but the first idea of childhood as a construct actually gave rise during probably around the Renaissance. Prior to that, children as young as 6 were not in any way fundamentally different than adults. Their language, the way they dress, how they worked, the labor that they did, their legal rights, the games they played, everything was essentially the same as an adult. There was no real clear distinction. And because of this, there was no thought, that it didn't occur that we needed to shield children from reality. They had full exposure. Ideas like death were right there in the forefront. That nowadays we see us more or less trying to shelter kids from some of these concepts. But death, violence, sex, these things were out there. And then nobody thought that to separate from that. Now, prior to this, and the reason why they have this idea that childhood came about this time is brought forth in evidence from pre-Renaissance art, where they depict children essentially as small adults. Pictures of them at bridal feasts, drinking with the adults, no clear separation between them. Even adults fondling or groping children. There is no, again, distinction between the adults and the children in that picture other than size. Now, the reason why you the start of this adulthood. Sorry, the reason why it was generally around 7 that they talk about in the book here was that the onset of adulthood was came with language. Um, it was the real separation from infancy to childhood. Anything younger than the age of 7 was still, for all extensive purposes, an infant. And this also played into a lot of the different elements of the cultures at the time too, or just the facts of the society. That the mortality rate of children was so high that if you made it to 7, and add that were able to communicate orally, you were an adult. You made it at that point in time. Your chance of dying from a childhood disease became noticeably less at that point in time. But this is a time when oral communication was the main factor that separated infancy to adulthood. That at a time when the majority of the population was illiterate, that there was no need for children or anybody really to read and write, and because of this, that being able to orally communicate as a 7-year-old put you on pretty much the same even ground as any adult at that point. Now, where this started to change, and I'm probably going to ask Ozzy a little bit on this one here, is with the onset of the printing press. The printing press, when it was first introduced, kind of changed society as we know it. It kind of it changed us from an illiterate society into a reading society. That there was a lot more focus put on the people being able to read. And because of this, they realized too that if you wanted people to read, it's best done at an early age. Reading is this unconscious reflex, as well as an act of recognition. And it forms a lot easier during the time when the brain is still engaged in the task of acquiring oral language. So it takes a lot longer for someone to learn how to read than to orally communicate, and because of this and how they want to encourage at a younger age, that they started separating childhood from adulthood, in the sense that you weren't really considered an adult until you can read. Now, because of that, this is where we start getting to the first separation, the recognizing between childhood and adulthood. It's shifted now from the just being able to orally communicate to be able to communicate through writing. And this brought on the introduction of things like schools and other educational systems that separated children from adults. And the construct of childhood started forming from there. And over the next several hundred years, the childhood was encouraged to be this separate thing. And when this went on until about, like I said, for a couple hundred years, until we get into modern time. And this is where things have changed now. And this idea of childhood that we had that came out of this this separation, this noticeable separation between childhood and adulthood, is starting to vanish. That because of the media, because of television, because of things like this, these things that we started to shelter children from with this invention of childhood, sex, violence, death. This is all stuff that's now very prominent on TV. There's no real buffer at stopping a 10, 11-year-old from seeing these things. Even it's not just like sex. I mean, you like in what sex is, but it's like even like just you have commercials nowadays advertising jeans that are the equivalent of softcore pornography. And the distinction, all the things that came up between with this invention of childhood, the different language, the different mannerisms, the different dress, the different games that they played, all these things are vanishing. Sorry, I have notes on this. The language, like children are, when they watch TV, they're talking the same way that adults are. The way they dress. A kid can wear sneakers and sweatpants, but then again, so can a 50-year-old man. You have kids going to birthday parties in three-piece suits. You have kids and adults, both wearing high heels. I mean, take a look at shows like Toddlers and Tiaras, where they dress, children up essentially as adults. The games they play, football, pee-wee baseball, just miniature versions of the games that adults play. All the things that separated children, that came out of this rise of childhood, are vanishing. That we're going back to this time now of children just being treated as small adults. And if we keep on going down this route, Neil Postman theorizes that childhood will disappear. And like I said, he thinks that that's going to be, a social disaster. But that's the basic thesis of the book. Oz, did I miss anything there?
No, that as a thumbnail sketch goes, I mean, that's really good. That was fairly thorough. There's a few things I would add, because the thesis of the disappearance of childhood is a little bit puzzling to people when they first hear it, because we're not used to thinking of childhood as a social invention, but it is. But we're used to thinking of it as a biological category. I mean, there are babies, and then there's infancy, and then there's childhood and adolescence, and adolescence really is just sort of the end of childhood, and then there's adulthood, right? We have a tendency to think of childhood as a biological category, right? But Postman's point is that the way we regard children, young people between the ages of, say, 17 and 18, is fundamentally different now than how children were seen in the past. And you gave examples. In the past, children didn't dress differently, didn't speak differently. Things we didn't expect very much of children, that they should behave differently. It was expected that once a child had fully acquired oral communication skills, that there was nothing that needed to be kept from them. There was nothing you could keep from them, really, because once they could speak and understand what was being spoken around them, they were fully inaugurated into the world of adulthood. This is why the Catholic Church, for centuries and centuries and centuries, said that the age of reason was 7 years old. Right. This is at the age at which you stop being a kid and you stop getting a pass, morally speaking. Why 7? That seems awfully young. That seems bizarre to us. It's because by around 7 years old, a child has picked up enough words as a command of his or her native language sufficient to interact meaningfully with adults. There is nothing that you can keep from a child. If the only thing in the media environment of a child is orality, you can't really keep a kid out. And so children were expected to work. They were expected to practice religion. They were not kept in the dark about anything. As you said, divorce, death, violence, disease, crime, everything, the kinds of things that we shelter children from, bad language, the kinds of things we shelter children from now, we didn't shelter children from back then at that age. We didn't think there was any need to. What would be the point? We don't realize nowadays that the idea that children are innocent and are to be kept innocent and should not be made to work, and that they are essentially pure, and are to be protected by everybody all the way into late into their teens. This is a social innovation, and according to Postman, it is a humane social invention, one that protects children from the ravages of life, allows their minds to grow to their capacity. Children really have one responsibility in our culture: learn and play freely, because that's a great way to learn. But the idea is that children should be insouciant. They should be carefree. They should not be troubled by concerns about money and death and taxes or anything. They are to be sheltered from that. We don't even talk about these things with our children. We're not supposed to talk to children about these things, except very, very gradually, and only as they get closer and closer. And the reason childhood, as we understand it, as a group of people who are to be protected and sheltered and kept in the dark, that's the important thing, kept in the dark, is it has to do with the invention of the printing press. Europe at the time was, prior to the printing press, was largely an oral culture. There were a lot of people who could read, but most people couldn't read. And those who could read couldn't read well. Most people in the ancient world who were literate learned to read in adulthood, and they read like this, with their finger on the page or a pointer, and they moved their lips. Right? I mean, it's hard to imagine that you were considered a good reader, a fluent reader, an extraordinary reader, in fact, if you could read silently without moving your lips. I think there's a passage in the book that Postman mentions where it might have been St. Augustine, can't remember now, remarking on with wonder at someone who's reading without moving his lips. Right? But that's what happens when you learn to read late in life. It's like you read with an accent. You read slowly, haltingly, in broken reading, like broken English. It's not fluent. It's not effortless. It's not easy, and it's not fast and efficient. But if you learn how to read in childhood, everything changes. You become a native reader. You acquire a typographic mind. But it's hard to learn how to read if there's not a lot of reading materials. And the printing press made the reproduction of pamphlets and books that were written by hand, manuscripts. It allowed them to be written in a standardized form, to produce a standardized typography and standardized spelling, in multiple copies that were identical everywhere, so that people could now talk about a book, and everyone could be pretty much assured that they were reading pretty much the same thing. And this changed the culture. There's a wonderful book by a historian named Elizabeth Eisenstein called "The Printing Press as an Agent of Change." I mean, it's a huge 2-volume fat tome, but it is fantastic. There's very, very few cultural innovations and technological inventions that have been more transformative in human history than the printing press. It changes the way we think. It changes the way our minds operate. It enforces a kind of linearity of thought and a seriousness of thought. It slows down thought. It requires that you sequence and order your thoughts. It requires that you sit for unnatural periods of time staring at a page. It's the most unnatural activity, and that you forestall your interruptions and your questions, because the person whom you're reading can't answer back. You can only read and take notes if you want, but it requires patience. It transforms your mind. And one of the things that happened with the printing press is, as the printing press, the invention of the printing press spread out, the application of it, and more books were published, and political discourse and theological discourse especially was carried on this way. But also commerce required the ability to read now. It became understood that reading was an important skill. And since this was a skill that was learned in adulthood, this was a skill that was important to adulthood. And at some point, people started teaching children how to read. But another thing that happened with the printing press was it was now possible to discuss with a degree of seriousness subjects that had to be discussed orally before. But now you could discuss subjects that were forbidden, and in a written form. And one of the things that happens now is that the media environment of a child is no longer only an oral world. There's now the written word, but children don't know how to read. And so Postman argues that it is actually the printing press that gives birth to childhood, because the cleft between adult and child happens with the printing press as widespread literacy takes root. As people become literate, the thing that demarcates an adult from a child is more than anything else is the capacity to read. And it takes years to learn how to read. I mean, we're pretty good now at teaching people how to read. We weren't back then. So um, the invention of the printing press gives birth to a distinction, a social distinction that never existed before, that never could exist before.
Well, can I
And,
can I jump in on that point there?
of course, yeah.
Yeah, because the example that they kind of that Postman kind of highlights in the book is in the case of two men that were charged with the same crime, William and Paul.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, and let me just read this out here. It was the year 1605. They attempted to burglarize the house of the Earl of Sussex. Now, they were both caught and convicted. But the exact words of the sentence as given by the presiding magistrate was, the said William does not read to be hanged. The said Paul reads to be scarred. That Paul's punishment was not exactly merciful. That it meant that it would have to endure the scarring of his thumbs. But unlike William, he survived because he pleaded what was called the benefit of the clergy. This, which meant that he could meet the challenge of reading at least one sentence from an English version of the Bible, and that ability alone, according to English law in the 17th century, was sufficient grounds to exempt him from the gallows.
Yeah, benefit of clergy was an important thing, and what that example illustrates is the very high value that people placed on literacy. And so, of course, rich people wanted their children to read, and of course, what the rich people do, well, the people who are not quite so rich want their for themselves and for their children, and on and on all the way down. And so, what ends up happening is society begins to value literacy, and eventually um, um, childhood gets created because now discourse can take place in a realm that's inaccessible to children. Children can't read; they don't know what's going on. Subjects can be talked about with seriousness and literally for centuries without children knowing what's going on. Um, and children cannot participate meaningfully in commerce and religion. They can't have a political discussion. It's hard to imagine having a political discussion with a 7-year-old, but you could back then. But that's because the seriousness of an adult back then wasn't as great as we might imagine it. Postman argues that we have adults and children now as a result of this distinction, but there was a time when there were no adults and children. What there was infancy, and then there was what he called the mind of the adult child, a child that is an adult that is really, by our standards, juvenile and immature, and the kind of moral seriousness that is bestowed upon us through typography and literacy is an innovation, and again, that marks the cleft. So childhood is constituted in secrecy. Childhood consists of being kept in the dark, of being not told certain things, and slowly being inaugurated into the secrets of adulthood, very, very gradually, under the theory that your mind cannot handle these things, which is hogwash. Your mind can handle these things. There's a cost, but a child can handle an awful lot of things that we would never inflict upon our children. So the incunabula, the cradle, of childhood is the printing press, according to Neil Postman, and that's because it creates a meaningful social distinction that couldn't have existed before, but could only exist because of the printing press and widespread literacy. And he says, if you look at history, what you see is, in the ancient and medieval world and in the Renaissance world, early Renaissance world, what you see is what we would call children today depicted as little adults. They dress like little adults. They engage in little adult activities. They have to work like adults. They're not sheltered from anything. We have paintings of children being diddled and fondled and drinking and carousing at outdoor banquets and fairs and bridal feasts, just like all the adults are doing. Today, this would be considered pornography, but then nobody thought anything of it. They weren't ashamed. It wasn't risque or racy to depict such a thing. It was just, this is just how you treat children. But that all changed. This was a social fact, but the social facts changed, and one of the social facts that changed is that children are supposed to be kept in the dark. They're supposed to be protected and sheltered. Their minds cannot handle it, and the best thing that you can do for a child is let them play and let them learn. Children only have one real moral responsibility: go to school and learn, especially learn how to read, because learning how to read is how you learn everything else. And so children get carved off and as a different social class, and what ends up happening is children are segregated. They start to play together. Schooling has the effect of keeping people who are of the same age year after year hanging around with, befriending, and playing with only people exactly their age. In grade 1, you play with a 6-year-old. In grade 2, you play, all your friends are 7 years old, and on and on and on, all the way through high school. You are surrounded with people. You grow up with a cohort, a group of people who are just about exactly your age. That's how things have changed. It used to not be the case. The idea of a generation gap is a product of schooling and our conception of childhood. Um, and children are assigned clothes. There's such a thing as children's clothes. There's such a thing as children's games. There's such a thing as children's speech. Um, and Postman's view is that all of the things that keep childhood in place, namely the secrecy, the keeping children in the dark and safeguarding them, this is all being undermined by electronic technology, where now, through electronic technology, discourse takes place in the electronic world. And the electronic world is a world of audition and orality that children are privy to. And now children are privy to all the things that we used to keep them sequestered from. So now they can watch Oprah or the CNN or whatever, and they can see war and pestilence and death and divorce and incest and everything that we would want to keep children from. They see it now, and this
Yeah,
undermines childhood.
the one of the examples again that's brought up in the book that's really good about this is that when you teach a child to read, that there's a certain amount of syntactical and lexical complexity that is different depending on what level you're at. Somebody in grade 1 is not going to be reading the same thing that somebody in grade 7 is going to be reading. Someone in grade 7 is not going to be reading the same thing as someone in grade 12 is going to be reading. But with television, it's all out there. Television is catered towards the widest possible audience. A lot of it's generally pretty adult oriented. Most people recognize now that you even watch cartoons now, because there's a certain amount of cartoons that, and I'm not even talking about things like Family Guy or Simpsons, but I watch cartoons with my son, stuff that's on Teletoon, stuff that is geared towards a younger audience, and the amount of adult humor that's actually underlying that goes into some of the shows, and my son doesn't understand, but it's there. I see it. This stuff is now prevalent for every single child to see. Oh, sorry, did we lose Ozzy?
Sorry, I'm having a little problem here. Yeah, the world of electronic media. I mean, and when Postman wrote this, he was thinking of things like radio and television. I mean, there was no internet when he wrote this book. I mean, he was not. The internet did make things rosier for him, as he sees it. I mean, think about pornography, right? I mean, think about how. I mean, when I was a boy growing up, if I wanted to get my hands on some smutty stuff, I had to, you know, uh, sneak into my dad's Playboy collection or something like that, right? That's how it usually went, right? Or you had an older brother, or there was some older kid who had some Penthouse magazines or Hustler or something like that. Really, you just couldn't get your hands on this stuff. Now, any child has access to all of the wealth of pornography that would have been unimaginable just a couple of decades ago. You can imagine what this can do to the psyche of a child to be introduced to the sort of the full-on hardcore world of pornographic sex. I'm not trying to be a prude or anything like that, but we have to sort of acknowledge the fact that the informational environment of children with respect to certain things like sex is completely different. That landscape has changed irrevocably. It's not an exaggeration to say that the average 12-year-old can inform their parents about all kinds of sexual matters now. It can name positions, could name acts, and has a vision of what sex looks like and how it ought to be conducted that is vastly different than, well, sometimes vastly different than reality, but very vastly different probably than what their parents practice and would want envision their children to practice when they're old enough. So the informational environment has changed.
This also brings on an interesting point, and up to this point, when I was actually reading the introduction stuff and like the formation of the first part that kind of lays out where we get this idea of childhood from. and starting to go into these ideas now that that this childhood is disappearing. And one of the stats that the books puts out that kind of caught me off guard was that between 1950 and 1985, because I think this book was written in the late 80s.
Yeah, but so.
Yeah, between 1950 and 1985, the increase of under 15-year-olds, people that are under the age of 15, in what the Federal Bureau of Investigation had described as sex crimes, went up 11,000% between 1950 and 1985.
Yeah, well, one of the liabilities of the disappearance of childhood is that as the distinction between adulthood and childhood disappears, we stop thinking of children as innocents who need to be protected, and they cease to be seen as 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 precious, and they start to be seen as potential sexual objects. I mean, remember, boys and girls in their early teens, are fully capable of having sex. Girls, start menstruating. I mean, for most of human history, people were having sex in their teens. As soon as a girl started menstruating, I mean, she could be married. I mean, in the 17 and 1800s, if a girl was not married by 17, she was she was on her way to spinsterhood and being an old maid. I mean, you needed to get married by then, before you lose the flower of youth, right? So what happens is, when the distinction between childhood and adulthood starts to evaporate, to disappear, adults now start to look at children as potential sexual objects again, in a way that we had stopped doing. It's not to say that it's unnatural to do so, but presumably not a very good thing. I think I agree with Postman. I think childhood is a humane institution. It does good for children, and I think it's a civilizational good. I'm glad that we have it, and I think it's a distinction and a social artifact worth preserving. It's, something like democracy is an invention too. It's worth preserving, and childhood, this idea of a prolonged period of innocence and secrecy and ignorance imposed upon children while they do nothing more than play and learn, and are slowly inaugurated into the adult world. That I think is a good thing. And so children start to get sexualized, though, when childhood disappears. And moreover, it's not just children who start to sort of get potentially victimized this way and seen differently. And I mean, our models, our female models, are like 14 years old now. I remember it was quite shocking at the time, but it's no longer considered shocking. I remember when Brooke Shields did those jeans commercials. I don't remember. I think it was Guess jeans or something like that. Calvin's. It were Calvin Klein jeans, and she posed provocatively, bent over at the waist, or her ass sticking out in skin-tight jeans, with the slogan, "Nothing gets between me and my Calvins." Right? It was arguably the most sexually provocative ad anyone had seen in North America, and she was about 14 at the time. And that was considered quite shocking. That nobody even inquires about a model's age now. But if you look at look at models, right, fashion models, how young they are. I mean, they're incredibly young. They are children, and these are the very models of sexual attractiveness and beauty. They are the Aphrodites of our culture. So clearly, we are sort of moving back, and another aspect of this, though, is that there is a valorization of youth that happens. A valorization of maturity happens when you have this distinction between children and adults. You place a high value on adulthood and maturity, and the signs of maturity. But when that distinction gets blurred, we move back away from the child and adult to the world of the adult child, and so you find people now worshiping youth. I mean, nobody wants to get old and decrepit, right? But there is a desire to appear youthful now that is kind of odd. One doesn't want to look like a 20-year-old. One wants to look like a 15-year-old. I mean, the highest compliment you can you can pay a mother in her mid-30s or early 40s is to mistake her for the sister of her own daughter and say, oh, I thought you were sisters. Why should a woman in her 30s or 40s want to be mistaken for a teenager? Right? I mean, it's kind of odd, right? Why should that be? Why? Um, well, this is one of the consequences of the return of the adult child. We are losing this distinction. The premium and value that we place on maturity, and therefore the signs of maturity that indicate maturity, are disappearing. All kinds of things are disappearing. Children's games are disappearing. The idea that children should dress differently from adults. I mean, as you said, children and adults now dress the same way. Basically, adults now want to dress like teenagers. It's not that children are dressing in three-piece suits. I mean, that's actually kind of weird. It's kind of a
but it does
thing.
But it does happen.
It does happen, but it's
Yeah.
kind of quaint when it does happen, right? But what's more likely to happen is that people, as soon as they're away from work, want to dress like teenagers. So the idea that there's a serious way to dress, a serious way to speak, right, is disappearing, right? Parents want to be hip. They want to be cool. They want to be mistaken for teenagers. They want to look and sound like teenagers. They don't want the seriousness of adulthood. It's considered stodgy and old-fashioned and square, and all of that. There is a cult of youth that is permeating our culture, and according to Postman, this is a symptom of the disappearance of childhood. The disappearance of childhood as a concomitant, and that concomitant is the disappearance of adulthood. Both are being replaced with the adult child. It's essentially a teenage mind, teenage in intellectual maturity, emotional maturity, and moral maturity. And as he sees it, this is not a good thing.
So we got so we have Floyd, Xbox, Peripheral Prophet, and Quantum. Oh wow, hey Quantum, how you doing? I didn't even see you come in. Quantum Overlord in the discussion here, and try to bring them in on this as well. From what you guys have heard so far, what are your initial thoughts here on what Neil Postman has kind of put out here in this book?
Is this a question being addressed to me?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. By the way, Xbox invited me into this hangout because he thought I'd find it quite interesting, which I have done. It's a very interesting discussion. The sorts of opinions I have on this are more from a biological standpoint, so I'm not sure how useful my opinions are. But
one of the things that, like I said, is that was laid out by Postman in the beginning is that there's no set biological rules for being a child. So I mean, he does kind of touch on. Let me see if I can bring my note here again. It says that there is inside of our genes, there contain no clear instructions on what or who is a child. Is what he puts out in his book.
I'm not sure I entirely agree with that. I mean, I think you can define childhood as the period from when you were born to after you finish puberty. I mean that's fairly crude, and it's not one that's used legally. But I think that it's quite a useful thing to do. Maybe not necessarily when just thinking about humans, but it's quite a useful thing to do for the purposes of comparison with other species, which I think is quite an interesting exercise. So of course, different species have different lengths of childhood, which you can find some interesting things about.
In the biological world, we speak of juveniles, right? But teenagers, around the time of puberty, that's it. That's when the juvenile period ends, right? So I mean, in our species, childhood is not a biological category at all, right? Otherwise, we would be sort of treating children differently and only treating them as adulthood around the age of puberty. But really, around the age of puberty, typically what changed was they developed a strong interest in sex, and they could get married, and they did get married, and they did have children. But before the social invention of childhood, and this was an idea that sort of arose in the Renaissance after the invention of the printing press, and then was reinforced in the Enlightenment. Prior to all of that, children were treated as adults. I mean, we're shocked to hear that in the Industrial Revolution, at the time of the Industrial Revolution, children were working in factories. Yes, they were working in factories. They've been working in mines for a millennium. Like we just didn't think anything of making children work exactly like adults. The idea that they're precious, that they should be protected, that they should not be made to suffer or fend for themselves, people just didn't have these ideas. It would have be seen as bizarre sentiment, right?
What going back to just the biological question of this is that a lot of times, like an animal that's juvenile, that we would consider juvenile, doesn't possess the abilities to survive on its own. And there are certain traits that animals have that increase their chance for survival, or whether it's fangs, claws, their venom or whatever. These things are developed that allow them to better survive, better adapt, being able to run faster. These things will develop, and you can consider that maybe they're out of the juvenile stage once all these evolutionary traits, or these traits that these animals have fully developed, so that the animal can be self-sufficient.
Could you? Sorry, go on.
But you take a look at an animal like a human. Our strength lies within our brain, our cognitive abilities, and these are not things that you can compare to anything else in the animal world. That it takes a much longer period of time for these skills to fully develop, and so maybe from a biological standpoint, we can say they're juvenile until these skills have fully developed.
So I mean, you could consider. I'm sorry. I think my last response was a little bit inadequate because I see now that we're treating childhood as a more of a sociological concept, which kind of gels with a lot with what we're saying. So it kind of makes sense. So in terms of the animal kingdom, or in terms of other species, then it makes sense to define childhood as a period of learning, which of course it's not limited to humans. And it makes more sense in other social creatures like the other members of the great apes. And as far as I'm aware, humans actually have the longest period of learning, the longest period of being rather very much dependent on their parents. But I think there is something to be said for that definition, to define childhood as simply a period where you're still learning, and that seems to be rather consistent with the legal definition. So you're no longer a child at the age of 18, I think, in most cultures, and that's sort of the age at which you leave school as well. So the age at which you sort of stop learning and you sort of transition into the work life. But as you say, I mean, there have been times in the past where children have indeed had to work. So I mean, isn't that an argument that childhood's getting longer rather than shorter?
No, it has been getting longer and longer for centuries. It's been getting longer up until the last few decades, up until around the period of electronic communication in the 50s, with the advent of television, and then all of a sudden, the world of adult secrets is just unleashed upon children, and children now. I mean, I'll give you an example. Look at how children were depicted in the early days of television. Look at old black and white TV shows like Father Knows Best and stuff like that. And Lassie, and look at how children are depicted. Look how they dress. Look how they behave. Right? They are the very models of how children should be for that culture. And they are, of course, deferential to all of the adults, but they typically dress differently. They play differently. They have habits of speech. Look at the seriousness, the maturity with which the adults in those shows are presented. Then look at a modern sitcom, and you will find that the parents are buffoons. They're clowns. They don't take their work seriously. They don't take their families seriously. They certainly don't take their religion seriously. If there's any mention of religion at all in a sitcom, typically there isn't. And look at the children. The children are, will be sitting at the table with the parents, mouthing off, lipping back at their parents, talking about everything that the parents talk about. There's no sense of we can't discuss this in front of the children in a modern sitcom. That's almost gone. If a modern sitcom were to depict adults and children as they used to be depicted around the time when television shows first started airing, it would just be seen as the most archaic and quaint thing. People go, I don't even recognize this. This is not how children are. This is not how adults are. Yet in the 50s, when these black and white shows started coming on, people looked at these shows and they didn't think, oh, look how quaint and all that. No, they thought, yeah, this is how it ought to be. This is approximately right. Of course, it might be an idealization, right? But nevertheless, these are the models of what adults should look like and what children should look like. We wouldn't think that now.
Leave it to Beaver, the wise father that knows everything, and
that's right.
Yeah, and the show is about the kids learning, experiencing. But yeah, I mean, there has been this noticeable shift away from it when they try to, make the protagonist of these shows the child, and they don't want to depict the child, or that the children don't want to watch a child that's being depicted in the same way that maybe they're being treated as the subservient to the parents, because that's the attitude that we have now, is that this rebellious nature that that could be a topic on its own, but where children want to grow up. That's the other thing too, is that there's this need, there's this desire at a young age that while some adults are trying to cling on to there's this adult child years, you have younger children that just can't wait to grow up. My niece is 6 years old. She can't wait to get married. But Floyd or Xbox or Peripheral, do you guys have anything that you want to add to on the basic outline of the topic?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like they brought up technology. With the internet and so forth, it is almost impossible to keep information from children. I mean, in the past you could, but now all kids have to do is just go into Google, and type it in, and they have all the information in the world available to them. So, the age of restricting information from children is going to be harder and harder and harder, and you're going to have to go to more extreme lengths. You're going to have to deny them use of a computer. You're going to have to deny them use of TV and so forth, and you're literally putting blinders on them, and which only increases their temptation and their curiosity to learn. So they're just going to go behind your back more to learn these things. So I think it's getting harder and harder, and perhaps in some cases we when we talk to them, we can't treat them like children, and we have to kind of treat them more reasonably, saying, yes, this is the way it is, and but there's negative consequences for some of the things that are considered adult actions and so forth, and you should enjoy your childhood and not try to grow up too quickly, and just focus on your schoolwork and playing with your friends and so forth. But the cat has been the cat is out of the bag, so to speak, as far as trying to censor information from children and so forth. I think it's harder and harder and harder to do that nowadays. Also, I think the requirements for children is also increasing. The demands of getting good grades and going to college and preparing for a career, I think that's only increasing. I know quite a few teenage kids going through high school, and they're told by guidance counselors and so forth, if you want to get in a good college, you not only need to get good grades, but you need to take certain courses and do certain volunteer work and be active in clubs and things of that nature. So it's almost you're building your resume, so to speak, the minute you hit your teens. So definitely society is changing in regards to that.
I think one of the things, and that I was thinking about as I was reading this, was that we don't encourage children to play the way that we used to. I think back to, even with my own son. My son's 6. He's a child. He's not even at that stage yet where, he'd be considered an adult, 1,000 years ago or anything there. He's still 6, and sometimes he's goofy, acts silly, stuff like that. And I find myself scolding him sometimes, when he's doing stuff that's just really ridiculous, and I think about this now, and it's just like that, that's wrong. Yeah, it's kids are silly, kids are goofy. This is what they do. If he wants to run around with a weird hat on and sing songs throughout the house, try to keep it down, whatever. But I shouldn't be stifling, the silly behavior, the stuff that makes a kid act like a kid. But this also brings up this idea that maybe this is just a social shift in how we treat kids, that we don't let kids be kids. We're living in a time now when we medicate our kids to make them calm, normal, or what we interpret as normal. The amount of cases of things like ADHD that get diagnosed, in some cases misdiagnosed, because sometimes there's a legitimate cause for that. Other times, some parents can't handle kids being kids, and I know that kind of does upset some people when you say that, but it's almost like we want kids now to be little, what's the term, automatons or whatever, little robots, and that this is a social shift that I think that we've had in our mindset of what we expect of our children, and that we expect them to grow up faster. We put that pressure on them. Anybody disagree?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it is a shift. The question is, I mean, from Postman's perspective, is what occasioned this shift? What caused this shift? And is it a good thing? Is it good for children? And is it good for society? Postman, I think, would say, well, the reasons why it's happening are the ones that I've already outlined, and that you have outlined already. And whether it's good or not, he would say, I think it's a bad thing. I think it's bad for children to be plagued and burdened with these responsibilities, and have to deal with these concerns. And it stunts their emotional, intellectual, and moral growth. There's a tendency to think that the longer you've been trying something, the longer you've been exposed to something and practicing something, the better. But the whole idea behind childhood is no. You need this period of unfettered learning and play and growth, where your mind can develop its cognitive capacities, and then you can apply yourself to these things. Prematurely, or well, not prematurely, but prematurely by our standards, having to confront these things actually stifles you. It mires you in the business of the world, of having to do stuff, of having to get stuff done, of having to worry about work and relationships and things like that. And we do everything in our power to keep children, not having to worry about work and relationships and death and taxes and sex and all the rest of it. And so I think he would say that it's actually a very bad thing. Even if it's just a social shift, it's probably not a good social shift as he sees it. And if he's right that our conception of the mature adult and our conception of the innocent child are two sides of one coin, that they are concomitant, that they go together, then what it means is that it's not just children that pay a price now and later. It's we adults who become sillier and goofier and more prone to juvenile behavior, juvenile attitudes, and juvenile thinking. So I think he would say that on balance, it's whatever the explanation is. If his analysis is wrong, he still sees it as an unfortunate social shift.
Peripheral or Xbox, did you guys want to add anything in?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just listening and I'm kind of trying to take it all in. Just my own 2 cents. I think children are a lot more intelligent and capable of learning than we give them credit for. And I mean, it's difficult in a social, well, in a scholastic setting where you have to appeal to a large group at once. It's hard to, you know, give each child that individual attention at the rate of learning that they're capable of. Um, so I guess that's kind of an issue. But overall, I think that we could do more to facilitate children's learning. I don't know where I'm going with this. I think that we do treat children like children for too long. I think that children, obviously, there's certain things they're not going to care about. They want to play and things like that. That's great. But you know, when I don't have a kid yet, so I don't really have a lot of experience in this area. But I'm expecting when I have my son 5, 6 years old, he's going to want to play and goof off and stuff. But at the same time, I'm going to want him to, or expect that he'll want to mimic something I may be doing in the garage or something like that. Training him up for what he'll be doing as he gets older. That's kind of I think it's important. And aside from the sexual stuff, which I think should obviously be kept from children until their minds develop to handle that situation. But there's a lot of things that we could teach them that are going to be beneficial directly as they get older. And I don't know. I just think they're a lot smarter than we give them credit for.
Can I interject there?
Sure.
Yeah.
Postman doesn't think that children aren't smart enough to handle these things. He thinks they're smart enough to handle these things at 7. They have been. They always have been.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Right. The question is it good for them, and is it good for society to not essentially have childhood, to have infancy and then the start of adulthood? Is there not some benefit, morally, emotionally, and intellectually speaking, to this prolonged period of keeping children in the dark and protected and sheltered? Is there not some good that comes from that? Are we not all the beneficiaries of that, is what he would say. He doesn't think that, children can't handle it. That's the myth. That's the fantasy. That's the lie we tell ourselves and tell our children. You can't handle it. Every 13-year-old can handle sex. We've all done it for millions of years, right? We are the first few people. This is the experiment, right? The last few centuries, we are the ones who have said, no, 13, too young for sex. There are places in the world right now that don't think that 13 is too young for sex, too young for marriage, too young for work, too young for warfare, right? We are the ones who are carrying on this weird social experiment. And I think he's right that this has been a humane social invention. And it's all predicated on withholding information from children under the assumption that they can't handle it. But it's not that they can't handle it because they're absolutely incapable of handling it. It's that they'll handle it better once their minds have developed in a certain kind of way, and once they've had the benefit of schooling, once they've learned how to read and therefore have learned how to learn and have acquired the typographic mind and the kind of seriousness that characterizes a fully mature mind. Only then should they be permitted to launch themselves into adult concerns.
Well, that's one of the things that I found when I was reading it, and to play devil's advocate here for a second, is that I don't think Neil Postman really illustrates a good reason why childhood is needed. It talks about it that it's a humane invention. It talks about that it's a and I don't think anybody here would doubt that they don't want a 7-year-old being treated like an adult. But I guess the question is what is wrong about treating a 7-year-old like an adult?
Okay, well, if the question is, what's the benefit? Just ask yourself, would you want your 9-year-old treated like an adult? The expectation that they will work, fully introduced into all of the ugliness of life, an end to play. That's it. You're done play. No more playing. Throw the toys away. To work. Get on with the business of adult life. I mean, can you imagine being a 9-year-old. I mean, there are 9-year-olds in this world, unfortunately, who live in such conditions, right? You wouldn't trade places with them, and you wouldn't trade you wouldn't visit that upon your children. So what he would say is, okay, this is just a more miserable existence for a child, but there's also the fact that um, um, children are small people, and they are very exploitable. And unless we treat them as people who must not be tampered with, must not be treated as adults, and must never be negotiated with like they're on an equal footing, they will be the victims. They will come out the losers on average, just because they're smaller. And not only are they smaller, but they have less life experience, and their cognitive capacities are still growing. Well, one thing that I think we have learned that is a real benefit is that the teenage mind isn't finished. Okay, biology might have prepared us so that we're fully reproductively capable at around 12 or 13, but that doesn't mean that our brains have reached their optimal capacities for what they can achieve. I think that one of the things that we've learned from this prolonged period, this artificially long period of childhood and schooling, whether it's homeschooling or schooling, the more traditional way that we do it, institutions, that this has shown that you can in fact produce a child that is smarter than its parents. One of the things that when universal education was instituted, when people were required to send their children to school, there were truant officers, remember, to make sure that children were going to school. It's because kids weren't used to going to school. It was kind of a new thing, but mostly it was parents who didn't want to send their kids to school. Truant officers existed primarily to make sure that parents were sending their kids to school and not keeping them at home and working on the farm and such. One of the things that people resisted and resented about schooling was that their kids came back smarter than them, a lot smarter than them, right? They could outread them and outmath them, and they could outthink them. And I think that's one of the proven experiments of this prolonged period of childhood, is that without it, adults are not going to be as smart. They're not going to be freed up to learn, right? To treat children as adults when they are, by our lights, still children, is to say, you're never going to go to high school, right? I mean, imagine that. Just that fact alone. You're never going to go to high school. Why? There's no time to just all day long go to school, right? I mean, that's just going to disappear. And with it, everything that comes from knowing what you learn in high school, which is perhaps not as much as it used to be and as much as we would like, but nevertheless, it's a lot more than if you don't send them to high school at all. Imagine if you don't school them at all. Imagine if from the age of 7 you just say, that's it, school's done. You're never going to learn how to read, right? Learning how to read is not, people think it's just a skill. Learning how to read is a discipline. You have to sit your butt down and not move for unnaturally long periods of time if you're 7 years old. Right? I mean, just try to get your kid to sit, right, and not move for hours. There's only 2 ways to do it, right? Make them do it, or give them a video game that entrances them, okay? But for that, they're not just going to sit. Kids are just too physically restless, and their minds get bored too easily. I mean, that's why video games will entrance them, is that the images are constantly changing on the screen, and there's always something slightly new and different to do, and there's these little goals and incentives along the way that keep them sitting there. There's an artificiality in that situation that keeps them sitting there. But reading is not like that. Reading is boring. Reading is hard work, right? I mean, it'd be like someone saying, here, sit down and do this Sudoku all day long, or sit down and do these crossword puzzles all day long when you're not interested in that. I mean, that'd be torture, right? If you remember what it was like learning your ABCs, the first thing you got to do is you got to learn how to recite this stupid alphabet, right? And then you got to learn how to spell small words, and then and you have to learn how to read, and it takes years, and it takes years to get a proper command of the written word. And then writing, that takes even longer, because reading is one thing, writing is another. That's an even harder skill, right? To communicate effectively in writing is even harder than just reading. And we already live in a culture where, literacy is fairly well taken care of, but there's a lot of people who are illiterates. Illiterates are people who can't read. Alliterates are people who won't read, who don't value reading, right? Who will get everything off of YouTube videos and television and things like that, but don't care to read about anything or look anything up if it's written down. So this is a very unnatural thing. It doesn't. I mean, taking things in through information through the eye all at once visually, that's natural. Taking things in through the eye this way, line by line by line, forestalling your own questions and your own impatience, and just patiently sitting and drinking in someone else's thought, that's a very unnatural thing, and it takes years. And imagine if you said, we're doing away with it. We're doing away with that. And people won't learn how to read. Right? It'll be rare that there'll be, parents who are wealthy enough that they have the leisure to teach their children how to read. Most people would not learn how to read, but for the fact that we've said children have a responsibility to read, it's good for society and it's good for them. Therefore, we'll have institutions where everyone goes and learns how to read and learns how to learn everything else. And for that, they have to be freed up of everything else. And a consequence of that is they're all going to be together. We're going to have children playing together, right? Year after year after year. It's a completely unnatural thing that we do. And it creates all kinds of weird things. It creates the generation gap where parents, when they surrender their children to schools, are surrendering the intergenerational social intercourse that would normally happen with their families and friends and neighbors. And basically they say, here, kid, you spend 8 hours with people exactly your own age. And next year you're going to do the same thing with people exactly your own age again and again and again. And consequently, the people that have the most influence in their lives are their peer group. And parents surrender, they abrogate their influence, their control over their children. And that's why as kids start to grow up and, once they hit puberty, I mean, kids really want to express their autonomy because biologically speaking, they're adults, right? Biologically speaking, they're adults, not socially speaking. And so now they fully want to express their autonomy, and the people they respect the most are the people exactly their age or perhaps slightly older, whom they mimic. And so that's why there's this generation gap that usedn't to be. This is a function of childhood, and so I think that there's some bad things that come with the invention of childhood, but on balance, I think it's a good thing. And just try to imagine what would happen if you got rid of childhood.
Well,
go ahead.
Talking about some of the bad things now that can come out of this, and Peripheral kind of mentioned it when he brought up there, is that he thinks that we've created this childhood, this age range is 10 years between 7 and 17 right now. Once you hit 18, for all extensive purposes, most places, well, Neil Postman's book, I should probably point out, directly talks about North America as the experiment that he's talking about. And in North America, yeah, 18 in most places where you'd be considered an adult. I actually can't really think offhand any other places. I know in Canada here, some provinces 19 before you can do things like drink, and the US is 21 before you can drink. But I think on the most part at 18, you're considered an adult, more or less. But for a 17-year-old or a 16-year-old, that there's no I don't think there'd be a lot of argument that most 16 or 17-year-olds can, read and write very well, if not on par, the same as any adults out there. But the way that they function is very similar to an adult as well. Do you think there's any additional possible damage that can come out from this by telling people that, for all intents and purposes, should be considered adults, that they're not yet? Forcing people to, to stay in childhood for longer than they might be, required.
I'm sorry, I was communicating with someone else. Forgive me, I didn't hear the question. I'll have to leave it to someone else to answer.
No problem. Peripheral, you asked the question before where you said that you think it was too long. Why do you think that it's too long, and do you think that it's bad to tell somebody that, for all intents and purposes, should be considered an adult that they're not yet?
Is that what I said? I'm not really sure what you mean by that.
Okay.
Can I just add in a
Sure.
point briefly? Um, I'm just wondering though, in terms of the college and university system, would people agree that in some ways it seems like this I'll call it pseudo childhood because of what you've just said, the sort of blurring between the child and the adult child as you called it, but this sort of pseudo childhood lasts now until after the people graduate from college, because college seems to me to be an artificial environment that does seem to mimic the environment of school in many ways.
Yeah, it feels like this idea of childhood gets, maybe in some cases pushed farther beyond than what we just put as the arbitrary kind of 17 standard.
Yeah, man, technology is kind of a wild card in all of this. I mean, things are changing rapidly these days, and children are, my brother's daughter, for example, has, her own iPad, and it's monitored. She can't just get on the internet and just look at whatever she wants, but she's playing games and stuff like that. Um, so things are changing, regarding how accessible information is, and I always felt personally, I felt limited in grade school. I'd be reading chapters ahead while other kids were struggling to get out a sentence, and I was always interested in more, but because of the rate that I was being given the information, I felt like I was kind of hampered in a way. You know, I know that there's different programs to kind of set aside for kids that want to learn faster, or kids that can't learn as fast for whatever reason. I don't know what that is entirely. I'm not really sure what all the psychology is behind it, but I think that kids are able to understand things more than we give them credit for. I really don't know how else to say that. I mean, I guess if you think about it back in time, different periods of times, you learned what your father taught you, right? Like you kind of were raised up to do whatever your father was doing at the time. You may have had, the occasional kid go off and do his own thing, but yeah, I don't know, man. The aspect of like playing, I don't think that should ever stop just because we're children and we become adults, right? There should that same level of playing and stuff like that, interaction on that level can happen at any time in our lives. It's not. I wouldn't restrict it to just childhood, for example. But obviously, children they're gonna play more and they're gonna learn different social skills and stuff like that. And there's correction that comes out of that when there's inappropriate behavior that teaches them something, but talking to children, at least talking to them like they're adults, I think that's going to challenge them to want to know what you're saying a little bit more. I don't think it would make them, grow up too fast or anything like that. But I like I said, I don't have a lot of experience as a father, and I think that would probably be more beneficial for me personally in this conversation. I do plan on educating my child, um, teaching him, you know, talking to him like he's an adult, teaching him how to talk, how to read. These things are very important because I do want him to learn, um, and I want to facilitate that process as much as possible, but not in a way that kind of, it's like an oppressive kind of thing. I don't know.
Well, if it's a good point, because if we're talking about how childhood is this humane invention, this humane idea that we came up with for the process of encouraging children to learn at that time, um, yeah, there could be play as part of it, but should we just encourage the learning? Should that be what this time is about? Is that less about childish things, and while you can still shelter them from childish things, should we only just promote education?
I don't think you can separate the two. I think the one of the best ways you can educate people is through play. I mean, I think there's been a lot of studies on this, and it seems sort of logical if this is the case because I mean, in the animal kingdom, this is essentially what happens. The offspring are play with each other. So you can look at things like tiger cubs. I mean, they'll play with each other, and in the process of learning, how to do things like hunt or become adult tigers. I mean, in the case of humans, this sort of artificial expansion is more for the late childhood periods, from sort of age 12 onwards. But definitely before that, the idea of playing is very much a natural and sort of ingrained concept in it's part of the human condition, I think.
Well, one of the questions that did come out on the side chat on one of the points that you did make there, Ozzy, was that you were saying that suggesting this idea that adults shouldn't be as immature as they are at times. Eve brought it up in the external chat there, and I thought it was an interesting question. Should we all be like what was the father's name? And leave it to Beaver there. Was he Wally or I can't remember.
I don't know. I've actually never seen the show.
Yeah, I can't remember. But anyway, the wise, like always serious, just caring father. I mean, should we ever grow out of that immaturity? You bring up the point that we have these adults that want to stay in this adult child mindset, and that has to do with some of the behavior that we do. I joke around all the time. But is this immature behavior something that even as adults we should be moving away from? We should recognize ourselves as adults and not as adult children.
Okay, I'm glad this came up, because maturity doesn't mean humorlessness, right? It doesn't mean that you have to be boring and that you can't play, right? That you can't engage in recreational activities. I mean, well, first of all, if you're a proper mature parent, one of the things you ought to be doing is playing with your damn children and not just parking them in front of video games all the time. You should actually spend quality time, right? The expression quality time is an expression that only arises in a culture where we are effectively neglecting our children, not spending enough time with them, and then having to say, well, that's okay, the time I spend with them is quality time. All time that is spent with your children doing what you should do with them is quality time. Unless you're neglecting or abusing your children, it's all quality time. So quality time is kind of a weird idea, and you should be part of that quality time. Part of the time you spend with your children should be playing with them. So you shouldn't stop playing. And of course, adults play. I mean, we have sports and things like that, and we have all kinds of recreational pastimes. I mean, one of my great loves in life is canoe camping, backpacking, hiking, bushcraft, winter camping, snowshoeing, all those sorts of things, fishing. These are all recreational activities. This is play. I mean, every other day that I can when the weather's nice, if I can get outside, I hike off into the bush. Right now it's June here in Ontario. It's bug infested. It's like the mosquitoes are thick. Black fly season has just ended, but the mosquitoes are horrible. I went out the other day just to string up my tarp and start a fire in the pouring rain, surrounded by mosquitoes, not because I'm a masochist, but because it's play, because it's recreation. I want to challenge myself learning my fire building skills and camping skills under less than ideal conditions, under what would be otherwise unpleasant conditions. Okay, that's play. I'm just playing in the dirt. Okay, I think I'm a fairly mature person, right? And I suppose I come off as a little stodgy, and I don't want to hold myself up as the very model of how people ought to conduct themselves.
Why not?
Well, because I fall short of what my actual ideal is. But you don't have to be humorless, dry, boring, and unfun to be mature. Mature just means you don't act juvenile. If you want models of how people behaving, juvenile, look at some of the hangouts that we witness. There you will see adults, grown adults in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and upwards, acting like the most stupid high school brats. And all of this drama, it's all this high school stuff, and all this incestuous back sniping, and I mean, that is juvenile behavior. That is childish behavior. They're on full display on the internet forever for everyone to see. You will see the paradigm of the adult child. There it is. Look at some of these clusterfuck hangouts, right? There's the adult child, right? I think people from adults from the 1950s and 60s, if they were to see that, would not just be sort of slack-jawed at at the technology that makes this possible, but at the conduct, the immaturity of this conduct. I can't think of a sort of a better case of the adult child than how people conduct themselves in Hangouts sometimes. So I think that, yeah, I think as you grow up, you should become mature, and maturity here. I mean, here's. Remember, I said that reading is a discipline. Okay, maturity involves discipline. It's self-discipline. It's self-possession. It's self-mastery. It's control of yourself. Right? That's what children lack. That's what they learn during that whole long, artificially extended period of childhood. They're learning self-mastery. They're learning discipline, right? But they're learning it less and less. And they're learning it less and less in part because as this distinction gets blurred, adults start to emulate children. Children start to emulate adults. And they both zero in on the same juvenile teenage behavior. And consequently, as the models of maturity behave more and more juvenile and immature, the lower the standard is on what the child is supposed to aspire to. So I mean, it just seems to me bad all around, and so that's why I think it's worthwhile preserving childhood for so long. It seems weird because you think, geez, by the time you're 17, you really know right from wrong, and most of your cognitive capacities are, pretty close to fully developed and all that. But there's more to maturity than just intellectual development, right? There's moral development and emotional development. There's social intelligence. That only comes with time, years, and experience dealing with other people. But most importantly is self-possession, self-mastery, self-discipline, the control of the self. I mean, I'm interested in something called virtue ethics. A kind of ethical vision that I subscribe to is virtue-based ethics. And the principal virtue, the virtue that undergirds all the other virtues, is not just sort of self-knowledge, but self-possession, self-control. I mean, ask anybody who knows me very well, and there are a few people in the community. There's a handful of people in the community, maybe one or two, who know me very well. They will tell you Ozzy's not very well self-controlled at times, but of course I don't put that on display in a public hangout. People who know me very well know that I can be as juvenile and uncontrolled and immature and emotional as anybody else. I know sometimes I seem a little bloodless, but that's because I have a fully developed sense of shame, and that's another thing that disappears with the adult child. The sense of shame disappears. There's such a thing as misplaced guilt and misplaced shame, but there's also such a thing as properly placed shame and guilt. Those are the things that act as levers on you and make you not want to misbehave again in future, because it feels bad to remember what a fool you made of yourself. And unfortunately, if you look at these hangouts, one of the things that characterizes the adult child, no sense of shame, no sense of public decorum, no embarrassment at behaving like a child when you're a fully grown adult. So it seems to me that there's a lot to be had from extending this period of childhood. But of course, it has to be the case that there are adults for children to emulate. And if there aren't, if there are only teenagers because adults are emulating teenagers, then we have a problem.
I don't think more true words have ever been spoken. Well, in regards to the Google Hangouts here. No, that's great. Welcome, Scott. I know that there was a point that Quantum brought up there a few minutes ago. I don't mind going back on this one if you'd like to ask that.
Yeah, Quantum was talking about how college is kind of an artificial environment and an extension to childhood. And I think that that's definitely right to an extent, but what college and university does for young people is it's the first time that they're able to live without their parents taking care of them, and it gives people from age 18 to 23-ish an opportunity to be on their own without being fully thrown out into the quote-unquote real world. I think that's definitely very valuable. It's useful in my life as a college student to have this opportunity to be independent for the first time. I think it's really important given the dynamics of what we have with childhood today.
Can I speak to something that Scott said there?
Sure.
Because I had a weird experience when I was a grad student.
Actually, sorry, 1 second, Aussie. Just before you do that, I'm just going to, for this show here, I'm going to throw the link out as private here, as public. If anyone else wants to come in and contribute to this conversation, feel free to. But as long as you're coming in to contribute to the conversation, please. Sorry, go ahead, Ozzy.
Thanks. Yeah, I had a really weird experience that reinforced this sense that I have that Postman's right about this. I mean, broadly speaking, I don't think he's right about everything, but I think on this he's mostly right. And here's the experience that I had. I grew up. I grew up in Quebec. I went to high school, and high school goes to grade 11 in Quebec. There's no grade 12 or 13. And then I want to go to university. But before you go to university in Quebec, there's something called Cégep. It's an acronym. It's in French. I won't translate it, but it's basically college, and it's kind of like junior college or community college. It has the look and feel of university, but if you're going to university, you can either go into like a 3 or 4 year old vocational program, like a job training program, or you can go into what's called the pre-university program. The pre-university program is where you decide that you want to take some science courses, or you want to take social sciences or humanities or languages and literature or something else. And I went into the social sciences. It's for 2 years. Okay, it's 4 semesters, and it's basically pre-university. It's baby university. Okay, it feels like university. You take your own courses. You decide what you're going to take. You plan your own schedule and stuff like that. They treat you like you're in university, but it's Cégep, and the students there are typically 16, 17, and 18 years old. There was kind of an interesting little experiment there when I contrasted that with when I went to another university. I went through this system, and then I went to university. And one of the things that happens along the way is people mess up in Cégep. People get this autonomy. Suddenly they're away from their parents. They're out on their own. They're going to college on their own. They may still be living at home, but they're picking their own classes, and there's no principal or teacher writing home with a report card. Johnny's not doing his homework, right? You're free to really mess up if you want, and they do. A lot of people just bomb out. They crash and burn, and then they can't get into university. They got to wait a couple of years, reapply, go to Cégep, or reapply directly to university when they're old enough. Consequently, when students go into university in that system, they have a certain kind of maturity that I found was absent in other universities where I was a teaching assistant. When I was a teaching assistant in university in Quebec, teaching first-year university students, they were as mature as I expected them to be because I went through that system myself. When I was a teaching assistant at the University of Western Ontario, it was different. Students there go through high school. They go to high school up to grade 12 and 13. There's no Cégep. Then they go straight into university. Or a lot of them were American students transplanted, taking courses in Ontario, and they were a lot younger, emotionally speaking. And it's because they hadn't gone through this period of a quasi university. They went straight from high school to suddenly they're living in residence or they're living in an apartment on their own without that gradual transition, sort of living at home, going to Cégep, and then moving out onto university. They went from high school straight in. There wasn't that gradual slope, and there wasn't this weeding out period where people sort of mess up and then they can try again, and so consequently I walk into this classroom and I was amazed. Here I am in a classroom of 18, 19 and 19, 20-year-old students, the same age as the students that I was teaching before, first-year university students, but their behavior, their attitude was completely different. And this was from one year to the next. So I went from teaching in university in Quebec to teaching in Ontario, and I was amazed at the difference in maturity level. They were just they were talking to one another all the time, and they were chewing gum, and there was just a kind of unruliness and high school behavior. And it's because this was like a little experiment where the ramp of gradually introducing them into the adult world was missing. They went from we're keeping them like children in high school, basically, to boom, suddenly in the adult world of university, where if you do great, great, and if you don't do great, no one cares, and if you don't show up and don't do your homework, Who cares? Even better. You'll flunk out. I don't have to see you. Next year or next semester. So this to me was kind of interesting as an experiment. Like, yeah, look at this. This is like a social experiment. From one year to the next, one university to another. And the only sort of difference, the real big variable there, was this gradual intermediate step of slowly maturing these young people, slowly introducing them into the world of adulthood in a gradual fashion. So one of the things I think that can go wrong is if we keep people in childhood, but we don't gradually introduce them, and then we suddenly fling them into the world. Well, that's not obvious. That's no good. It has to be gradual that you bring them into the world. That's the whole point of childhood. There has to be this sort of self-discipline and self-mastery. And the SAGEP system is one where people learn a bit of self-mastery when the conditions are not, where the bar standards or educational standards are not quite as high as they are in university.
And that's the system with the slope, however you pronounce it.
Yeah, the SAGEP system. Yeah.
SAGEP system.
That
sounds like it makes a huge difference. I've never heard of a system like that. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, well, I know if I'd gone from high school to university, I know I would have screwed up.
Right.
Yeah, in Manitoba, another province in Canada here, we have something similar. It was at the time called University 1, which very similar to that program that you'd have to go through that before you actually started your first year of university. I'm not sure if I can't remember if it was required. Yeah, no, it was required. Sorry, I think it was like a semester long. Actually, I have a question, but we have Prudent, Eve, and Opal have joined us here, and I know that they have either something to add or something to ask here of the panel. So start off with Prudent there. What's in your mind?
Yeah, I do want to mention that I think that's a bit of a mischaracterization, like what I heard earlier about college just being an area of transition where you're away from home. That's not the case for a lot of college students, because some students might go to a local university and they'll still live at home for another 4 or 5 years afterward. I mean, not after.
But that would support the point, though, right?
Yeah. Because it's a gradual transition, exactly. They'll still go out a lot. I mean, they still have to. They might have a curfew or something, but they still have to come home.
Right. They're not out partying all the time.
At the school that I'm at, most people are from not in the area. So.
Yeah. It depends. I mean, I don't really know the statistics on that. Like, what's the amount of out-of-state students versus in-state students, and whether or not they live in the dorms or not. That's kind of irrelevant.
That would depend on the specific university. Because if it's like a community college, then most people would probably be from the area.
Well, I mean, I go to a 4-year university, and it's only about 10 miles away from where I live. So
there's a similar example to what Ozzy brought up here. Is that when I first joined the military, I joined when I was 21. I'd already gone through some university. I'd already been moved out. I've had held jobs, kind of lived in the real world quotation marks there for a bit. And when I went through my basic training, I was going through at 21 with people that were fresh out of high school, 18, 19 years old. And the difference between the people that joined up in their early 20s compared to the people that joined up straight out of 18 was very noticeable. Without that, without being thrown into the real world, without actually having any of that real world experience, the shock of being in an institution like the military was a lot harder on them than it was on people that had to worry about actually real life issues for a bit.
I kind of find it a little bit interesting that culturally, in America, you guys call it school. I mean, in the UK, the university is never actually called school. I mean, right. It seems interesting because school does indeed have the childish connotations, whereas in the UK we call it university, and there's a very strong distinction between university and school, and we never actually call university school. So
we call it university, but some are called university, some are called college.
Okay, but you do sometimes use school as like a generic term. It's not something that happens in the UK. In the UK, school means something that a child goes to.
I got you. Yeah, like if my wife's going to college now, but if she came and grabbed her books, she'd say, "Okay, I'm headed to school."
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Not so in the UK. People would assume that you were going to like high school or something if you said that.
Right.
Eve, you were quite active in the comment section outside of the video, and I know that you want to throw some stuff in here as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to throw out some ideas that you could have pitched in here if you wanted, and I noticed that you did do that, so I appreciate that. I couldn't come in. Zach was being a little upset at the time, but I do think as far as immaturity and like adults acting as teens, I think that this has to do with balance as a parent with your child. And if there's not this form of balance, and I agreed a lot with what Prophet was saying, because you can't just keep them ignorant of reality altogether and just throw them out into reality. Once they reach a certain age, you have to teach them different levels of responsibility at different age and maturity levels. And I think that a lot of times when adults start acting as teenagers, it may be due to them either having a lack of learning responsibility when they were young and growing up, or even maybe a strictness where they feel like they were maybe even suppressed with their childhood and didn't get to express that. But I just want to throw that out there.
Okay, I'm going to start winding this down here, and for the closing remarks from the panel here tonight is on the topic of the disappearance of childhood. If childhood is disappearing, the way that we see it is, do we see, or do we think that we're going to be seeing this whole collapse of society, or is this necessary? Let me again go back to my notes. Because I love the way it was phrased here. And I'm not prepared at all. And I can't find it. Anyway, the way he describes it is that if we were to see the childhood to disappear, it would lead to a social disaster of the highest order here. Do you see childhood disappearing? And do you think that if it does disappear in the way that we've discussed here, that this will lead to a social disaster? So even though you just spoke, I'll come at you at the end there. Floyd?
Well, I mean, I would hope if we see it developing and coming that we make changes. I think all parents want their kids to grow up and have the best life possible. So if we don't see that happening, I think we're going to naturally make adjustments to make it happen. Whether or not we have a magic formula to make that happen is another question. And we talked before we went on air about all these different cultures. We talked about there's an evangelical subculture which practices quivering, where it's a very patriarchal society where women get married fairly young and are just expected to just be mothers and have as many children as possible and so forth. And then you have urban societies where people are living yuppie lifestyles and they have limited number of children or no children at all. So we do live in a pluralistic society, so there isn't a one-size-fits-all. But I think for parents who have kids, we all want our kids to have the best quality of life possible. So if that's not happening, I hope we as parents and institutions that teach children, learn and change their ways to simply produce, what's best for our children and society.
Thanks, Floyd. Opal, you haven't really had a chance to say anything here, but same kind of question to you.
Could you repeat the what? Sorry, I got lost in the chat. Could you repeat the question quickly?
Sorry, yeah. Right now, what Neil Postman is putting out there is this idea that childhood is disappearing. If we are seeing childhood disappearing, do we think that it's going to be leading to this social disaster that he predicts?
For the last part, I'm going to have to say no, because if it was truly leading that way, it would literally mean the collapse of society. I think what it is it's just going to change. It's going to go through some rough spots. I think mostly because of people. What I was going to get to is people have come more focused on the individual parts of being human. They focus on proper adults. They focus on proper kids, and they fail to bridge. But I mean, just because of I hate to bring this up, but the selection process. I mean, the ones that make it through are the ones that are going to push through. And as I said, it's just not. It's just not. Life has a tendency to pick up where others fail. It'll just change, but it won't.
All right. Thank you very much. Peripheral. Final thoughts on this?
I'm actually getting ready to leave. Sorry.
No, not a problem. Thanks for coming out, man. If you get to bail before we get off here.
It was really great listening to you and Ozzy talk back and forth, and Floyd and Xbox. Initially, I really took a lot away from it, and I want to process it definitely some more. And I'm probably going to go buy this book now.
All right. Prudent.
I've really got nothing really as like a closing statement.
All right. Quantum. To the question we're asking there.
Yeah, sorry that my points have been more towards the biological side. I don't really feel I can contribute to the sociology, but I will point out if it's noteworthy that the early childhood is far more important than the late childhood. So if we're talking about this whole end civilization thing, I would be less worried unless there was something significant happening to the early childhood, and by which I mean typically under the age of about 11. And the most important period is when the children are very, very young. So provided that is not interfered with, I think we're perfectly capable of adapting, and really not much is going to happen. But I really think that primary schools, I mean, there's a reason that they're called primary rather than secondary. They are primary, as in more important. Essentially, I think that's my view on this whole thing.
All right, thank you very much. Scott.
I think that some of the trends that we're seeing are setting up a lot of young people for failure, and they won't do as well as they could.
Fair enough. Xbox.
Yeah, I really enjoyed tonight listening to y'all talk. I haven't read the book, so there wasn't much I could really add, and y'all covered anything else that I probably would have added. So I appreciate everybody coming out, and I'm definitely going to pick this up to read it when we get out of here. And I kind of agree with what they're saying. I think the system would evolve in a way once major problems started popping up. Or I mean, I guess if people fall through the cracks, as long as we haven't created robots to do everything for us by then, we still need laborers and the lower jobs.
Has anyone read the Isaac Asimov series? I mean, he wrote a very interesting series of books about this exact possibility. Things like I, Robot. People might have seen the film, but it's a very interesting set of books to read if you want to.
Yeah, I actually read the I, Robot
if you want to. Yeah.
Not the movie one, but his book of it is really neat.
Eve.
Yeah, I think that it would be disastrous for society if we were to limit education, for sure. But I'm not so sure about other issues that we keep, 16, 17-year-olds from just because they haven't hit the 18-year-old mark. I mean, as far as sex, alcohol, these types of things, I still am very much question of. I think that they're probably more than likely going to participate in those types of things anyway. So I think that would make another conversation.
All right.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'm gonna leave the last words to Ozzy here after I'm done with my little spiel. I don't have a lot to say, but I think that one of the things that they highlight inside the book is that this is an ongoing process. 400 years ago, the idea of childhood came about. It perfected over, or not perfected, but altered over a span of 400 years. the like the book says, childhood in the form that we kind of understand it now, a result of maybe the last 100, 150 years. It gets honed, it gets altered, it gets better. And I think that what we see here now is that I don't think that we're at a final position. I don't think that this is the final state of what we would define as childhood. That if it does get pushed back on the age where, you know, we start looking at people in their teenage years again as adults, I don't think that that's going to have a huge effect. Like Quantum pointed out here, I think that the most important stuff that happens happens during early childhood development between the ages. I mean, I guess would it be, even earlier than 7, really, between 5 to probably 11, 12 years old, around that range there. That's the range where childhood needs to be protected. That's where I feel childhood the has to be preserved. But I don't think that necessarily pushing back on some of the teenage years of what we consider childhood would necessarily lead to this social collapse that Postman kind of puts out there. That the system expanded out, it's included up to a certain age, and before it finally rests on a position that we consider the ideal range for childhood, we could expect it to rubber band a little bit. So I would put it in that way, that, well, we might see some changes nowadays. I don't think, as long as we make the conscious efforts to preserve childhood in that early childhood development that we recognize, I think that it would just be the system adapting and not necessarily lead to a social disaster. But Ozzy, you have last word. Feel free to take it away. Anybody that's interested, Xbox is going to be doing an after show hang again, like usual. We can attack this topic, or we can talk about other random stuff. Doesn't really matter. Link will be posted afterwards. Go for it, Ozzy.
Thanks. Well, there's a couple things I want to say, but first let me answer your direct question. I think it would be disastrous if we allowed childhood to disappear. I agree with Postman that it's a humane social institution that we've invented, and as you said, it's an evolving one. The story is not finished, but it was a technological innovation that helped mark a potential difference within human society, so that we could class people into those who could read and those who couldn't read. And falling out of that comes childhood, right? I mean, nobody could have predicted this. No one did predict it. People didn't understand what was happening. And that's the way it is with technology. We adopt our technologies because of what the immediate benefits that they bring to us. We don't anticipate what's going to happen with the technology, what it's going to do to us, how it will transform our society. When automobiles were invented, people just thought this is just an alternative to the horse and buggy. We didn't understand that the success of this technology, the adoption, the embracing of this technology would transform our culture. That we would need a network of roads, paved roads, with ditches on both sides. That it would facilitate commerce. That it would lead to people traveling from where they live to a far away place. It would be practical for them to travel a great distance. That it could lead to the dislocation of families. We didn't anticipate that it would become a status symbol. We didn't anticipate that it would afford young people privacy from making out. We didn't anticipate that it would become a symbol of freedom, right? I mean, literally the physical landscape of North America and Europe has been transformed by the automobile. Nobody saw this coming. We don't embrace our technologies because of the long-term social impact that they're going to have. We can't even anticipate them. They're almost impossible to predict. Societies are just too complicated that way. The consequences are too hard to anticipate. We adopt our technologies for essentially they're all the wrong reasons. The short-term, foreseeable, practical gains that they will give us. And that's the justification we give for adopting a technology. The Amish, I think, are a little bit more sober. They try to think these things through, and they're a little bit technophobic as a result. And we are lovers of technology. We're technophiles. We worship at the altar of technological progress. But consequently, we have embraced all kinds of electronic communications that might be undoing childhood, and we've not been seeing it. And Postman is, in this book, is trying to alert us to that fact, that there are potentially devastating consequences to our social institutions, to our habits of mind, and to the fabric of our moral culture. And I think that's very serious. There could be a reversion to the way things used to be, where we see children as little adults and where adults behave like the adult child. That could happen. I mean, it's not inevitable, but it's inevitable unless we see it for what it is, see it happening, and properly understand what childhood is, and that it's not a biological category. So I would encourage anybody who's interested in this topic to read the book, The Disappearance of Childhood. It's very, very easy to read. It's 175 pages. You can read it in a couple of sittings. And he writes beautifully. Neil Postman is actually a very clear writer. And if you'll indulge me, I'd like to read from another book of his that is sort of like the twin. He wrote another book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And that book goes with this book. He writes an awful lot about the informational landscape and how it alters our mind. It changes our psyche, our habits of mind. And in the Amusing Ourselves to Death, he talks about how electronic technology is changing political discourse, and not for the better. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read a few paragraphs of this book. It's the foreword to Amusing Ourselves to Death. It says, this was written in the late 80s. We were keeping our eye on 1984. When the year came and the prophecy didn't, that the end would come, thoughtful Americans sang softly in praise of themselves. The roots of liberal democracy had held. Wherever else the terror had happened, we at least had not been visited by Orwellian nightmares. But we had forgotten that alongside Orwell's dark vision, there was another, slightly older, slightly less well-known, equally chilling, Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. Contrary to the common belief, even among the educated, Huxley and Orwell did not prophesy the same thing. Orwell warns that we will be overcome by an externally imposed oppression. But in Huxley's vision, no big brother is required to deprive people of their autonomy, maturity, and history. As he saw it, people will come to love their oppression, to adore the technologies that undo their capacities to think. What Orwell feared were those who would ban books. What Huxley feared was there would be no reason to ban a book, for there would be no one who would want to read one. Orwell feared those who would deprive us of information. Huxley feared those who would give us so much that we would be reduced to passivity and egoism. Orwell feared that the truth would be concealed from us. Huxley feared that the truth would be drowned in a sea of irrelevance. Think of the internet. Orwell feared we would become a captive culture. Huxley feared we would become a trivial culture. As Huxley remarked in Brave New World Revisited, the civil libertarians and rationalists who are ever on the alert to oppose tyranny fail to take into account man's infinite appetite for distractions. In 1984, Huxley added, people are controlled by inflicting pain. In Brave New World, they are controlled by inflicting pleasure. In short, Orwell feared that what we hate will ruin us. Huxley feared that what we love will ruin us. This book is about the possibility that Huxley, not Orwell, was right. So I think that gives you a character of what he's like as an author and how he thinks and the kinds of issues that he thinks about. And these two books, Amusing Ourselves to Death and The Disappearance of Childhood, they're like bookends. They're really one work. They're like part one and part two. So if you like the one book, you'll almost certainly like the other book. And one of the things I like about Neil Postman is, unfortunately he's deceased now, but everything that he wrote on makes you think differently about what he's writing about. You don't necessarily agree with him, but I think you will never come away from a work by Neil Postman without having your view of the subject completely enlarged. So I recommend it to you. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, guys. Thanks for watching, and see you guys next week.